All right, let's imagine for a minute, because we love imagining, let's imagine for a minute that you're actually a soccer coach. You love soccer, of course you do. You're a coach, and you're a good one. And let's say you just got a job at a new school as their soccer coach. So the first day of school, you go onto the campus, and you actually make a beeline straight for the playground. And you're watching these students play soccer on the playground. You think, they're not doing so bad, but not so good in some ways. And it's sort of chaotic, it's not really organized. I guess that's saying the same thing. And you walk over, and people have already heard that you're the new soccer coach, and what you do is you gather them all around, right? And you begin to point at people. Say, I'd like you to come with me. I'd like you to come with me. And you over there, I'd like you to come with me as well. And you don't really have to explain what you're doing. People know. You're the soccer coach, and you're pulling people out of a crowd. What are you doing? Well, you're assembling your what? Your soccer team. And you pull 11 people out of that crowd. Then you take them aside, and you begin to talk to them. Say, things aren't exactly the way you learned. Some of what you learned is spot on, but I've been watching you play for a few minutes, and there are some things that you're doing that really aren't a part of the game. And we've got to begin to train for some really important games. So rather than lecture you for 3 or 4 hours on all the subtle nuances of soccer, what I'd like to do is just give you 3 or 4 fundamental things that are very, very important that you pay attention to as we begin to practice. And then, of course, as we practice those 3 or 4 things, as we go into a real game, hopefully you'll remember them in the heat of the moment, right? And I'll also share some things with you that you should really try not to do, because that'll just get in the way of what we're trying to accomplish. And so you pick your soccer team, and you get them ready for actually playing in a game, not just on the playground. Now think what Jesus was doing. They didn't have soccer teams in his day, and in any case, what he was doing was far more serious than assembling a soccer team. He was talking at first primarily to Jews, people of his own race. They called themselves, because God called them, God's chosen people, right? And they had a long history before them when God created out of them 12 tribes, right? From the 12 sons of Judah. And they had a certain way of going about living life. Some was okay and right on target, but there were a lot of things that weren't so much on target. And so Jesus now comes on the scene, who's God the Son in the flesh, and as it were, he goes out onto the playground where all sorts of people are trying out different ways of being the people of God. Some had a long list of rules to obey that God had never given them. Others figured being the people of God would mean that we need to sort of have some fisticuffs with the government, right? We're going to start a revolution. That's what it means to be the people of God. And while there were other segment of God's people back then that said, being the people of God, it really doesn't have anything to do with beating up on the Romans or attempting to. What it really has to do with is secluding ourselves. And so there were some secluded societies, small groupings of Jews that would really dedicate themselves to being separate and praying. So there are all sorts of different ways of thinking, what did it mean to be the people of God? And Jesus shows up, if you will, on the playground. He says, gather around. Gather around. So I'd like you to come with me, and you over there, and I'd like you to come with me too, and I'd like you two to come with me. And he assembles a team, if you will, his Israel team. He picked 12, and he really didn't have to explain what he was doing. When he called them, he told those 12 what was up. Those 12 would help Jesus communicate what it really means, both in the first century and every century since, to follow God as his people. Well, in some form, that's how N.T. Wright explains the essence of the sermon Jesus preached on the mountain overlooking the Sea of Galilee. We know it as the Sermon on the Mount. It wasn't delivered once. Undoubtedly, it was delivered several times. If you have a message that really gets to the essence of life, why preach it only once? Jesus preached this sermon undoubtedly many times as he traversed Galilee, sharing what it means to be a part of the kingdom of God. You can read about it in Matthew. In the last couple of months, except for 6 weeks talking about marriage, we've been looking at the Gospel of Luke. And Luke, too, like Matthew, records the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Luke records primarily some highlights that he thinks would be applicable to the audience that he was addressing. And primarily, Luke had a heart for people that weren't Jews, because he wasn't a Jew. But he knew Christ came for all people. And so he took that Sermon on the Mount, and shares from it what he believes is most important for the audience that he had. So, as we'll see in just a moment again, and by the way, thank you to Joel who preached the last couple of weeks. On this particular occasion, Jesus had gone into the hill country surrounding the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, generally speaking, those that were following him, and there was an increasingly large crowd. He came down to a level place on the mountain, and then he selected those 12. He ministered to the crowd, some who were sick, others who were demon-possessed. He healed them, and he freed them. That's what he did. He preached, he healed, and he freed. He preached, he healed, and he freed. But what specifically was this sermon about? This sermon was about following. What does it mean to be an authentic follower of Jesus? As mentioned, the Jews had a particular understanding of what it meant to follow God, but now that Jesus had arrived, God himself in the flesh, it was time both to correct and to complete their understanding of followership. That's clear, isn't it? Of course it is. And this following wasn't just something offered to the Jews. Again, through Luke and many others, this was, as was Jesus' intention, a message of life that was for any and all people. So, that's what Jesus wanted, followers, authentic followers, to be in this world, living, breathing, real life, if you will, replicas of himself. What we see in this passage, we'll read it in just a second, again, is instruction for any would-be authentic follower of Jesus. And so he addresses life, and if you follow the entire sermon, Joel did the first half the last couple of weeks, but as you follow the sermon, you see it like any good sermon, it's broken down and organized in a specific way. You may not catch the organization right away, but the more you look at it, you see it. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ as you encounter certain life circumstances? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ as you encounter people? We all do, right? Some circumstances we encounter are positive, many are not. Some people we encounter are positive, many are not. What does it mean to be a follower in circumstances of life, encountering people? And then what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ when you have to ultimately encounter yourself as well? And then most importantly, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ in terms of encountering God and relating with him? He goes over those four: circumstances, people, yourself, and God. As I mentioned, Joel touched on the first two, but let's go back to the beginning of the setting for this sermon. Verse 17 in Luke 6. When they came down from the mountain, the disciples stood with Jesus on a large level area, surrounded by many of his followers and by the crowds. A very typical scene for Jesus. There were people from all over Judea, that would be to the region of Israel in the south, specifically from the city of Jerusalem, the capital of Judea, and from as far north as the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. Verse 18, they came to hear him. I mean, nobody could preach like Jesus preached. And repeatedly we would hear that when we would understand that when he would finish preaching, those who were listening would say, boy, that guy's got a wisdom we've never heard from anybody before. And so more and more people came to hear him. And what else? To be healed of their diseases. Hey, my friend's son had epilepsy and Jesus healed him. And everybody had an example of someone they knew that had been healed by Jesus. So what were they doing? I'm going to go get healed too. And those troubled by what? Evil spirits. They were also healed. Verse 19. Everyone tried to touch him. Well, of course. Everybody had a physical need, a real need. Because healing power went out from him and he healed everyone. All right. So everywhere Jesus went, people followed. People followed. He not only cared to heal them and to free them, what he really was after, though, was that they would understand where to find life. Where to find life. So, I mentioned circumstances, right? Verses 20 to 26, we won't go over them again, but you'll remember, Jesus said, blessed are the poor. Well, why would he say that? Well, because he said, don't worry about being poor because you won't always be that way. There's a blessing for you if you're poor in this life. There'll be a point where you'll no longer be poor. So, blessed are you. He also said to the rich, don't depend on your wealth because you won't have it for very long. So, blessed are you if you understand that. I won't have this very long, so therefore I won't live for it. He also said, if you're persecuted, be happy because one day your mistreatment will be turned into great reward. So he talks about circumstances. And then he also talked about people that you encounter, verses 27 to 38. He said, when you're hated by someone, overcome them with blessing. Now, if anything is counterintuitive, that's counterintuitive. Somebody punches you and you hug them. To give you a picture, right, of the heart. Someone injures you and you seek not to injure in response. What do you seek to do? To bless them. It's absolutely opposite of what our natural instincts are. And I was sort of jealous that Joel got to preach on this, and I'm not going to go and preach just on this one statement except to say this. You want to be free? One of the difficulties that happens when we're in a conflict with another person is that we feel tied to that person, and what ties us is the conflict. And we love to sort of call it a day, let's just be at peace with each other, but if they keep on at it, at points you keep responding in negative ways, you turn that into blessing, you will be free. It'll lighten your heart. It'll take the burden away. Think how it might be, whoever it is in your life that causes you the most consternation. Just think about blessing them instead. It'll take the pressure off. Jesus knows that. So bless those who persecute you. He also said not to judge others. Boy, that can be tough, right? I think in our culture we've turned this not judging into not evaluating, not having discernment, not having eyes that can see what's really going on. I can't say anything about anybody. Listen, just honest evaluation is not the same as judgment. Let's just say, for hypothetically, you've got a family member or a friend who's a drug addict. To acknowledge they're a drug addict is not judging them. That's just evaluation. Now, gossiping about their struggle, that's judgment. Suggesting that they have no hope for change, that's judgment. Being critical in your heart and your words about them, that's judgment. But simply saying, hey, they're a drug addict, they need help, that's not judgment, it's evaluation. But don't judge, don't assume they're beyond grace. So, Jesus had a lot to say in those verses 20 to 38 about circumstances of life. And if you really want to be a follower, how do you approach life? If you really want to be a follower, how do you approach people? He talks about forgiveness too. By the way, Jesus said basically your forgiveness needs to be infinite. You just keep on forgiving. 70 times 7, it's another passage, but 70 times 7, that just means don't ever stop. The Jews actually had a limitation though. This is one of the things that those children playing soccer on the playground, right, needed to learn. The Jews sort of playing on the playground, trying to be the people of God, what they would do, they put a limitation on how often you forgave. And Jesus said, that's one of the things, time out, that's one of the things you've got wrong. If you really want to be an authentic follower of Jesus Christ, after the third time they offend you, that doesn't mean you no longer have to forgive them. You always have to forgive. And so Jesus comes along with all sorts of kingdom principles that they were supposed to apply. All right. Well, let's pick up where we left off. We've looked at circumstances and people, and Joel did a great job at that. How about ourselves? How does a follower of Jesus Christ, an authentic follower of Jesus Christ, how do they look at themselves? Now, there's a subject. We don't like to think about ourselves too often, right? But that's a subject Jesus doesn't let us off the hook from dealing with. Verses 39 to 45. We'll look at them just a verse at a time. To say that a picture, right, is worth 1,000 words, we say that a lot. Here in rapid succession, Jesus paints word pictures. He's got a large crowd. He wants them to remember things. If he goes on and on and on and on and on, as great a teacher as he is, if he just drones on, they're not going to remember it all. So he gives these beautiful, quick word pictures, hoping that as they then depart, go into life, they'll remember the word picture and draw the right conclusion. So here's one of them. Verse 39, Jesus gave them the following illustration. Can one blind person lead another? Well, they all know the answer to that. He says, won't they both fall into a ditch? In the church where I grew up, in Sierra Madre, we had right across the street from our church, the Sierra Madre Boulevard divided our church and a blind hospital, or a home for the blind called Climb. And there about every Sunday, about 10 of the blind young people from Climb, they would come across the street. And that would be a major undertaking, you would think, if you were blind. We aren't, so we don't know entirely. But I remember as a kid growing up, I would watch one of the nurses or the assistants from the hospital walk with the 10 blind patients right to the edge of the curb. And then he'd let them know when it was green, but then he would let them walk across the street by themselves. And as you could envision, moving their sticks in front of them, the 10 of them made their way across the street by themselves, and they could actually make their way in the side door of the church and find a place to sit in the worship center, and then they would worship with us. They were a part of our church. And afterwards, they would make their way back again, and someone would just help them know when the light was green. So there is some independence, right? You say, hey, maybe the blind can follow the blind. Yeah, but we never saw them hike up the trail 3 blocks away to Chantry Flats. The blind can't lead the blind there. There's limitations. And what is Jesus saying? The blind cannot lead the blind. And he's really referring to the Pharisees. Because what they did, they inserted within the people of God what it meant to follow God as they saw it. And they added, as you know, all sorts of rules above and beyond what God had intended for them. They would see heart transformation really is not as an issue, just behavioral transformation. And Jesus is saying, hey, you follow them, you're going to fall into a ditch because that's not what it means to follow me. There are many very sincere Pharisees, but they also became sincerely wrong. And Jesus said, be careful who you're following. I don't know how well you know yourself, but you are blind. You are. So am I. We all are. None of us, and we can point the finger at the Pharisees or anybody else, none of us sees entirely in a complete way or an entirely accurate way what it means to follow God. We don't know everything. We're all blind to some degree. So what does a follower of Jesus Christ do as it relates to evaluating themselves? They're humble. They're humble. They know they don't have everything together. To piggyback on his point about the Pharisees' teaching, Jesus then added this little snippet. Students are not greater than their teacher. Again, it's just another word picture to help his audience remember. But the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. What's the point? Be careful who your teacher is. Make Jesus your teacher. Be careful. I would encourage you, make Jesus and the Holy Spirit your only ultimate instructor. And that means you're going to have a very high view of the Scriptures. It's the inspired Word of God where Jesus shows us not only himself, but how it is to live as an authentic follower of God. Inspired by the Holy Spirit, he'll work on your heart. Allow Jesus, permit Jesus to be your primary teacher. I know people that talk about, you ask who they are. Oh, I'm a Baptist. I'm a Presbyterian. No, you're not. Oh, you're right. I'm a Pentecostal. No, you're not. I go to a Baptist church. I go to a Pentecostal church. I associate with some of the particularities of their teaching, but that's not who you are. Who you are is a follower of Jesus Christ. We can get all wrapped up in a church, in a favorite lecturer, a favorite author, a favorite professor, a favorite seminary, on and on and on, and we just do whatever they say. No, that's no different than following a Pharisee in the first century. You are a child of God if you've embraced Jesus Christ. And he, in his Holy Spirit, there's your teacher. There's your teacher. Commenting again on the matter of eyesight, this is a really well-known phrase. He says, verse 41, and why worry about the speck in your friend's eye when you've got a log in your own? I went to camp when I was a kid growing up to Forest Home a lot, and there was this guest singer and guitarist that played one week. I never forget. He came with this big old foam cowboy. You know those big foam green cowboy hats? But then underneath he had this contraption that came over his head. You couldn't see it, a wire. And out one eye was this big old log, and out the back of his head was the other side of the log. And it looked like it went right through his head. And he came out, and he starts playing, and that log's just flailing around all the rest. And he wrote a song called Log Eye. And the whole thing was about how awkward life is if you got a log sticking out of your eye. Well, of course we don't, but how often have you forgotten? You haven't forgotten this. The speck in the log, we know this. Why? Because Jesus taught it, and he wanted his people to remember it. Be careful what you try to pull out of somebody else's life or what you see, what you identify. Because Jesus says, more than likely, that's the speck. And look what you got sticking out of yours. So we may not struggle with the same thing someone else struggles with, but I guarantee you do, as I do. You got something sticking out of your eye. Right? Right? We all do. We got to be careful. We're all broken. We're all in process. We all need massive amounts of grace, and thankfully, Jesus has massive amounts for us. So before we begin to point out the flaws in someone else, as my boys would say, take a chill pill. Take a chill pill. Calm down about somebody else's behavior, and use that. And I mean this sincerely, as if the other things I say I don't mean sincerely. But I do. When you see a flaw in someone else, what we need to do is train ourselves. Allow that to be the trigger for you to step back and look at your own self. It's not to suggest that whatever you see in somebody else must also be in you, but it is to say whatever you see in someone else, it may be something different for you, but there is something. And they need grace from you just as much as you need grace from them. The psalmist didn't say, search him, search her. The psalmist said, God, search me, and see if there's anything in me that doesn't reflect you, and then lead me in the everlasting way. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life. So as we're talking about the way a real follower, because again, this is all about followers. Jesus came to make followers. And so he tells us in this sermon, how does an authentic follower deal with the circumstances of life? How does an authentic follower deal with people? And now, how does an authentic follower deal with him or herself? Well, he or she deals with himself or herself in a very humble, reflective way. The speck and the plank are classic cases is a classic case, I should say, of what some psychologists call projection. The person knows there's something seriously wrong with themselves, so they try to avoid that problem by looking for something similar in someone else, however tiny it might be in that someone else. I remember back in my 20s, I had a Christian friend of mine come to me, and he brought another Christian friend along with him. And what they wanted to do in their mind was to talk some sense into me. I had found myself rather infatuated with a young lady. It wasn't Geraldine. That was love. This was infatuation. She was a Christian gal, and not to get into the specifics, she was just a wonderful person, but I wanted to go out with her, and they found that we'd already been on one date, and they came and said, listen, given certain circumstances I won't go into, but given certain circumstances, they said, listen, you shouldn't be dating her. Okay, I'm listening, but not for very long. A couple months go by, and to my surprise, it was revealed that the guy that came to me had been having an affair. He was married. Had been having an affair for over a year. I thought, now that conversation he had, and even the way he created the conversation to bring someone alongside with him, it just felt really strange. And maybe that doesn't happen a lot, but it happens enough for people to classify it as projection. I'm not suggesting that you project all over the place, but I am saying this: we can get to that point where we are pointing out flaws in someone else simply because we're hiding from the exact same flaw. Regardless, we're all broken. We need to be careful. The true follower of Jesus Christ is humble and reflective. So how aware are we of the areas of our lives which need focused attention? We need to be keenly aware. Paul certainly understood Christ's point. He said to the Galatians, "Dear brothers and sisters, if another believer is overcome by some sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path." Isn't that great? Gently and humbly help them. Not only because that's what they deserve and that's what they need, it also will be a safeguard against you falling into something, because you've gone with a heart of humility, a heart of gentleness. That's how the real follower of Jesus Christ approaches somebody else. Remain humble. And obviously, there is a place to help a brother or sister. Again, we get so afraid of judgment, right? It's not the fact that you call their attention to something, it's how you do it. At the end of this instruction by Jesus on this point, he says, once you've looked at the log in your own eye, then, and you take that out, you deal with yourself, then maybe God will use you to help them with the speck. That's how he ends it. Then you'll be able to take the speck out of the brother's eye. All right, then there's another image. Again, he's giving these little snippets, these word pictures to help them remember. Verse 43, a good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. A tree is identified by its fruit. Figs are gathered from thorn bushes, are never gathered from thorn bushes, and grapes are not picked from bramble bushes or from bushes with thorns, thorn bushes, right? Verse 45, a good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart. An evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. What you say flows from what is in your heart. I do not like this part of Jesus' sermon. If I find that I'm negative or critical, I do not need a speech therapist. I don't, because my problem has nothing to do with phonics, diction, or speech. I don't need a therapist, at least not a speech therapist. I don't have a problem with my tongue or my mouth. If you criticize people, if you gossip, if you tear people down with your words, you do not have a problem with your mouth. Jesus says you have a problem with your heart. Your mouth, my mouth, it's just the exit point for the condition of our hearts. Right? Our mouth is just the physical dispensary of our heart. And so what Jesus is calling for is cardiology, an honest, reflective study, evaluation of one's own heart. That's what a true follower of Jesus does as it relates to dealing with themselves. You see, word picture after word picture, Jesus is making a very clear point. And part of this had to do with the false teaching of the Pharisees, because they would say moral reformation or transformation leaves the heart unexamined or untouched. Just do these things. That's all you have to do. Jesus comes along and says, no, I don't want you just running around doing things. Check your heart. Check your heart. Are you right with me? And where you're not, let's talk about it. Check your heart. So what exits your mouth is simply the fruit of the heart. And speaking of the heart, that's what Jesus came to touch. He came to touch the heart. Aren't you glad about that? I know I am. I mean, everywhere in life we're told what to do and what not to do. We got this new app in honor of Tomas's. He didn't get his license at 16, he got his license at 17. And in honor of Tomas, we got a new app. It's called Life 360. And he hops in the car. We know where he is. We know where he's going when he arrives. And in the distance in between, we know how fast he's driven, how many hard stops, how many fast accelerations. It's great. I never have to say to Tomas, hey, let me know when you get there. Dude, I'm watching every block you drive. Pay attention to the rules. Life is filled with rules. Aren't you glad that Jesus came to change your heart? He came to change your heart, my heart. And out of that changed heart, what happens? Because of the Holy Spirit, what happens is we have a desire, yes, to do things. But just as criticisms and condemnations, right, and negative critiques flow out of our mouths from our heart, Jesus is saying, let me change your heart, and what will flow will be things of my spirit, not the world's. Oh, but this is a tough part of that passage. Our mouths. But thankfully, Jesus came to change my heart and yours too. So he talks about circumstances and people and how real followers deal with both and how a real follower of his will be reflective and humble. But then lastly, he comes to the final part of his message, and it's how does a follower of Jesus Christ approach, interact with, live in the context of the God they can't avoid? And that's what we see in the last 4 verses. He brings it to a real crescendo here of great significance. And so he does it with a very necessary but pointed question. This is Jesus. A very necessary and pointed question. You ready for the question? Verse 46, so why do you keep calling me Lord, Lord, when you don't do what I say? Wow. Why do you keep calling me Lord if you don't do what I say? Jesus' words remind me of Elijah in the Old Testament. God's people have been following false prophets and killing the real prophets. And the false prophet said, hey, worship Baal, which was an idol. Elijah comes along and says, I'm the only prophet left. You're not following God. So he set up this experiment, this test. And I won't go into all the details, but basically there are two altars, and he said to the prophets of Baal, you called your gods to burn the calf on your altar, and let's see what happens. And nothing ever caught on fire. And then he poured tons of water on his altar, and on top of the calf that he had dissected and placed up there on the altar, and then he called out for God to bring fire, and fire came and consumed it all. And then he says these words, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. I mean, doesn't it sort of summarize it all? If he really is Lord, follow him and forget the rest. Follow him. Follow him. We're all familiar with Queen Elizabeth and Great Britain and the royal family, etc. The Queen, as we know, really doesn't do very much these days by way of legislation and governing. That's due to the unique form of government, a constitutional monarchy that they have there. We all know in that form of government, Parliament makes all the decisions. Parliament passes and puts into play legislation. They govern the citizenry, not the Queen. And that's not all bad, but that's why they call it a constitutional monarchy. In the old days, as we know as well, kings wielded considerable and isolated power. But with the passing of time, Parliament cut increasingly into what was called the divine right of kings, who then wielded absolute power. Until now, what remains? Well, what remains is what you see with Queen Elizabeth, right? She's a wonderful person, but she's a figurehead, and an important one. But she doesn't really govern the people. Parliament does. At least half of whom are elected by the citizenry. Many Christians try to set up a constitutional monarchy in their hearts. I know my king, it's Jesus. But when it comes to passing legislation for how I should live, well, that's not his role. That's mine. I decide how I live. He's my king. Hey, you heard me call him last night, Lord, Lord. And when I'm in trouble, I say those words a lot, but he's my king. But I do what I want. I've lived that way. There are times I still live that way. That's not how a real follower of Jesus Christ interacts with God. A real follower says, you're my Lord, so I will follow you. And it's to Jesus' point. Why do you call me Lord? That's a tough question. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, if you're not going to do what I ask you to do? So, he then wants to make sure they won't forget his point, and he gives them what is also for us a very memorable word picture. I will show you, verse 37, Jesus says this, I will show you what it's like when someone comes to me, listens to my teaching, and then follows and obeys it. It's like a person building a house who digs deep and lays the foundation on solid rock. When the floodwaters rise and break against the house, it stands firm because it was what? It was well built. Verse 49, but anyone who hears and doesn't obey is like a person who builds a house right on the ground. Other versions or translations say sand. On the ground without a foundation. When the floods sweep down against the house, it will collapse into a heap of ruins. Another very memorable word picture. We've all heard that before, right? The house built on the sand, the house built on the rock. We have children's songs that are made to this passage. Reg Tollefson, he was a big 6'5" square-jawed, naturally muscular, blonde-haired, intimidating Norwegian. They're not all that way. I'm Norwegian. But Reg, he was a very hardworking, no-nonsense, tough guy if ever there was one. He served in Vietnam, the 6 bullet holes in his abdomen bearing witness. Some 15 years after Vietnam, every single day he still had to clean the exit wound of one of the bullets that had gone through his abdomen and right out his back. Like I said, he was a tough guy. Reg designed and he built custom homes in my hometown of Sierra Madre, one at a time, and he was good. The summer between my junior and senior year of high school, then the summer between my senior year of high school and my first year of college, I worked for Reg. I don't know why, but he gave me a job. One of the first things I learned was that Reg had a nickname. His nickname was Edgewood. He didn't tell me that. The other workers did. What's the natural response to that? Why Edgewood? I said, you'll find out before too long. What I found out was, as we'd be framing a house, let's say you're done with the second story, and Reg or Edgewood would be up on the second story, and he could, like, what are those, the famous family, the Walindas that walk over Niagara Falls? He'd just walk on a 2x4 like that. I mean, he could sprint back and forth, and he'd walk up there, and he's working away, but he would always have one eye on the workers down below, and if he felt that somebody was, taking too much of a break or being lazy, not doing what they're supposed to do, he'd take a chunk of 2x4, and he'd just, from the edge of the wood, he'd throw it down on them. So let's just say you learn by experience. My position description was, hey, you. That was my position description. As in, hey, you, move that pile of lumber over there. Hey, you, get us some coffee and donuts. Or, hey, you, get me that box of nails. Or, hey, you, dig me that ditch. I wasn't allowed to carry any tools because Reg didn't trust me with tools. One day, however, he decided he'd go out on a limb, pun intended, and he said, take this hammer. In this case, we were doing two houses at once. One house had the second story framed, the house next to it, we had just finished the foundation. I don't know how they do it today, but back in the 70s, you'd create these forms, these wood forms all the way around, and then you'd pour into the forms the concrete or the cement when it dried. You'd then pull the forms off the perimeter of the house, right? Well, he said, I want you to pull off the forms. So he gave me a hammer. It's the first time I held a hammer on the job. Again, he wouldn't let me. Well, we didn't know it. Before I got the job, I bought myself a tool belt. Never used it. It was in my trunk. So he gave me the hammer, and I screwed it off my car, popped on my trunk, got my tool belt, put my tool back. I got a hammer. I'm thinking, I got myself a tool. I'm a real construction guy. I'm not a hey you anymore. So I walked over, and I start prying off these boards, and everything went well for about an hour, and I came to one of the corners of the house, and mind you, he told me very, 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 very seriously, be careful not to yank the boards off. You got to slowly pry because you don't want to break the recently dried foundation. Fine. But I came to a corner, and I guess I tugged too hard, and I broke off a chunk of the corner of the house foundation. I don't know, like so. And I panicked. I looked, I mean, 2x4s, He'd saw it. He'd seen it. He didn't throw anything. He did something worse. He came down. He was a massive figure, as I mentioned, and he was red-faced. He walks over to me. He said, didn't you pay attention to what I told you? Everything in this house depends on the integrity of the foundation. He was right. Right for construction and right for life. And that's what Jesus is saying here. Foundation matters. Back in the first century, and there's a good reason why Jesus would use this illustration. As Klein Snodgrass explains in his book, excavations indicate that houses often were 1 or 2 stories of rough masonry construction with foundations cut into, not sand, but rock, cut into rock. Most houses had at least a layer or 2 of stone at their base, even if mud bricks were used at the upper layers. So especially in places, dry places like Israel, or we would say Palestine, heavy rains could produce just fierce flash flooding. So you needed to build your house, not just on sort of loose rocks fitted together, but you would dig deep enough to get into the rock, the granite beneath the soil, and you would cut into that. And the pre-existing rock is your actual foundation. Someone once asked, I was reading in the same book by Snodgrass, well, how far did you have to dig? And the answer is, as far as you have to, until you reach that rock, and then you cut into it. It might be a couple inches in some places. It could be 10, 15 feet. But you don't build the house until you get to the place where you can cut into the rock. Why? Because the foundation matters. You know that London and Palestine get the same amount of rainfall on average every year, about 22 inches. In London, they received those 22 inches over the course of 300 days, right? It rains a lot there. Or it rains many days there. The same amount of rainfall in Palestine, Judea in the south, will accumulate in just 30 days of rainfall. Those are heavy storms. Hence the flash flooding. Hence the need to dig into the actual rock. So when Jesus uses this as an illustration, it's the perfect one. It's the perfect one. Foundation matters. And so what does he say? The one who hears me and does what I say is the wise builder. Duh, makes sense, right? Just like the wise builder builds on a rock. Well, who is that person? Both people in Jesus' story, both hear him. Both hear him. Only one responds by doing what he says. That's the wise person. And we can get all sidetracked and make this about Jesus is the rock or his teaching is the rock. Well, yeah, Jesus should be our rock. And in other places, he's actually called the rock, right? But here, it's simply a matter of who's the wise one. The wise one is the one who obeys. The wise one who obeys is just like that person who, if they don't find stone 3 feet down, dig until they find it, and only then do they place their house on it. That's a wise person. And you be very wise. Oh, by the way, Jesus is saying that when you hear me say something, you follow it up with obedience. Oh, but I thought we were saved by grace. Yeah, you are. But what verifies your grace, and Jesus would say, the ultimate thing that verifies that you've received his grace is that you obey. We don't like this notion of obedience. Somehow we put it in conflict as if it's the enemy of grace. It's not. The Holy Spirit gives you grace for salvation and grace for obedience that then verifies that salvation. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck the house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. Jesus does not want that to be true of anyone, but he's saying it is true of some. Our faith, in other words, it must behave. If my faith doesn't behave, it's not real faith. It's Lord, Lord, but I don't need to do what he says. It's a constitutional monarchy, after all. Jesus is saying, that's not what I'm after. I'm not after someone that wants to live that way. I'm after them. I'd like them not to live with that perspective, but what I'm looking for are true, authentic followers. An authentic follower will verify they know me by obedience. It's as simple as that. And Paul understood it as well. He talks about the obedience of faith. Not just the gift of faith, but the obedience of faith, because real faith produces that. It doesn't gain for us salvation, but everywhere verifies we actually have it. So, what's true in construction is true in life. As we know, foundation matters. You're a builder. I'm a builder. We're all builders. We build every day. Every minute of every day, 24/7, we're building, 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 building. So if I want to build the way I've been told, I'll obey. And when it comes to life circumstances, poor or rich, I will know that the best is yet to come, that real life will be what I have with him. So if I'm poor, I'll endure it. If I'm rich, I won't depend upon riches. That's what a real follower does. When it comes to people, I'll bless the ones that persecute me, and boy, will I be free while they won't be. That's not what I hope for them, but I'll be free. That's how I'll deal with people. And myself, well, I won't turn criticism toward other people. I'll be reflective of myself. I'll be humble. And if God should use me to help someone else, I'll do it with a spirit of gentleness, kindness, knowing that I've been where they are and I might still be in other ways where they are, needing someone to come alongside of me and love and help me gently. And then when it comes to God, it's not a constitutional monarchy, it's a theocracy. He's God, he's the only one who is, and he's in charge. And so I just, out of wisdom, if nothing else, I'm going to do what he says because I believe he loves me. Foundations matter. What are you standing on today? Why don't we stand? We're going to sing. And as we do, if you want to be prayed for, maybe you don't know Jesus and you want to begin to follow him, we'd love to pray with you. There'll be somebody up here, several of us, and you just come on up as we sing. Don't be afraid. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be self-conscious. We all need Jesus. So if you don't have him, come get him. If you have some need, maybe for physical healing, maybe just a concern, you come forward. Whatever the need is, we'll pray for you. All right? Let's love God in this final song.